From the late 1800s until World War II, France ruled most of Indochina, including Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Indochinese Communist Party was founded in 1930 and staged a number of revolts against French colonial rule. These revolts were led by Ho Chi Minh. When World War II started, Japan took control of Vietnam in 1940. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam and formed the Viet Minh, an organization whose goal was to win Vietnam's independence from foreign rule, whether it be France or Japan. In 1945, when the Allies defeated Japan, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation, but French troops returned by the end of that year to reestablish French colonial rule. And so we begin to see the struggle of Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Viet Minh versus French colonial forces. The United States entered the Vietnam struggle in 1950 with President Truman sending $15 million in economic aid to France. And between 1950 and 1954, the United States would send $1 billion to help France fight the war in Vietnam. Eisenhower became president in 1953 and continued the policy of aiding France and Vietnam. And a lot of this was probably because the stalemate in Korea strengthened the U.S. resolve to halt the spread of communism elsewhere. During a news conference in 1954, Eisenhower explained this by use of the domino theory. In other words, if one country fell to communism, others were likely to do the same, much as in one domino starting a chain reaction among other dominoes. Despite massive U.S. aid, in May of 1954, the Viet Minh overrun the French outpost at Dien Bien Phu in northwestern Vietnam, thus bringing an end to French involvement in Vietnam. In May and June of 1954, the Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel into North and South Vietnam and called for an election to unify the country in 1956. The acting president of South Vietnam, Ngo Vinh Dien Diem, recognized the popularity of Ho Chi Minh and refused to allow these 1956 elections to move forward. Eisenhower proposed to support Diem if he provided a stable representative government. He offered little or no land distribution to peasants. He was a devout Catholic and persecuted Vietnam's Buddhist population, so his popularity was somewhat suspect. In 1957, the Viet Cong, a communist opposition group in South Vietnam, began attacks on Diem's government with the support of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh of North Vietnam. In 1959, the communist North Vietnamese began supplying South Vietnamese Viet Cong through a network of paths along the border of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. John F. Kennedy became president in 1960, and in 1961 he increased financial support of Diem's government. Kennedy also increased the number of American military advisors in Vietnam from 900 to over 3,000. And in 1961, U.S. casualties in Vietnam totaled 14. By 1963, there were 16,000 U.S. military personnel in Vietnam and over 500 U.S. casualties that year. Diem's popularity continued to plummet, and this was the year in which we saw Buddhist monks in Vietnam publicly burning themselves to death to protest Diem's government. On November 1st, 1963, a U.S.-supported military coup toppled Diem's government. Against Kennedy's wishes, Diem is assassinated. Kennedy falls to an assassin's bullet exactly 3 weeks later. Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president and resolves to prevent the spread of communism in Vietnam, although it was said that Kennedy intended to withdraw from the conflict. Interestingly enough, Johnson pledged not to send American boys to die on foreign soil to stop communism. And the whole time, the country was still sending more U.S. troops to Vietnam. On August 2nd, 1964, a North Vietnamese patrol boat fired at the USS Maddox while the American destroyer was patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin off the North Vietnamese coast. On August 4th, 1964, Vietnamese patrol boats reportedly launched more attacks against other American destroyers. These reports were never proven due to bad weather and poor visibility. But Johnson immediately launched bombing strikes against North Vietnam. He also asked Congress for the powers to take, quote, all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, end quote. This was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and Congress approved Johnson's request on August 7, 1964. Johnson did not tell the American people that the U.S. had already been launching secret military raids against North Vietnam. The Maddox was in the Gulf of Tonkin collecting intelligence for these raids when it was attacked on August 2nd. In February of 1965, a Viet Cong raid kills 8 Americans, and with his new war powers, Johnson unleashes Operation Rolling Thunder, the first sustained heavy bombing of North Vietnam. By March of 1965, the first American troops began arriving in South Vietnam, and by June of that year, more than 50,000 U.S. combat troops were engaged in combat against the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. Johnson won 1964 election on the promise that he was not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. You can almost hear Johnson saying that himself in his Texas drawl. Despite Johnson's opposition to sending American combat troops to Vietnam, support for the policy of containment and the advice of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk encouraged Johnson to begin sending tens of thousands of U.S. troops to Vietnam. On November 14th through the 16th of 1965, we see the first major land action in Vietnam between American and Viet Cong troops. This was called the Battle of the Ai Drang Valley. It has been immortalized now in the book and movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Some of you may have remembered seeing that or reading the book. Another instance in which the book was much better than the movie. 1965, by the end of the year, there are 180,000 American troops in Vietnam, commanded by General William Westmoreland. Westmoreland was less than impressed with the ability of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, to withstand the pressure of communist forces. He continually requested additional troops from the United States. In 1967, U.S. troop strength in Vietnam was up to 500,000 men. The U.S. entered the war in Vietnam believing its superior weaponry and firepower would lead it to victory over the Viet Cong. But the Viet Cong proved masters of guerrilla warfare, and their tactics turned the war into a frustrating stalemate. The Viet Cong lacked high-powered weaponry. They used hit-and-run and ambush tactics and a keen knowledge of the jungle terrain to their advantage. They moved secretly in and out of the general population, and it was often difficult for American combat troops to identify their opponents. They used a network of elaborate tunnels which allowed them to withstand air attack, launch surprise attacks, and then disappear. They laced the land with countless booby traps, landmines, and punji stake pits. And they were also receiving supplies from the Soviet Union and Communist China. Westmoreland's strategy for defeating the Viet Cong was to destroy their morale through a war of attrition, or by the gradual wearing down of the enemy by continuous harassment. But the Vietnamese had already been fighting for their independence for over 20 years. Keep in mind, Ho Chi Minh fought against the French before World War II. During World War II, the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong fought against the Japanese. And now, after France has been kicked out at the end of World War II, they're fighting against the Americans. So this was nothing new to the Vietnamese. Westmoreland introduced the concept of the body count, tracking the number of Viet Cong killed in battle. Westmoreland believed that as more Viet Cong were killed, others would eventually surrender. The body count was also used in an attempt to offset American casualties and convince the American media and public that we were winning the war. It was a battle for the hearts and minds Another part of the American strategy was to keep the Viet Cong from winning support among South Vietnamese people, and it proved more difficult than anyone imagined. The United States' use of napalm, jellied gasoline in bomb containers, and Agent Orange, a defoliation agent, to expose the Viet Cong injured innocent civilians and ruined livestock in villages. U.S. soldiers also conducted search and destroy missions which uprooted civilians with suspected ties to the Viet Cong. By 1967, there are more than 3 million refugees in South Vietnam. The irony of the hearts and minds strategy is summed up by a U.S. officer whose forces leveled the town of Binh Tre. He said, "We had to destroy the town in order to save it." Frustrations of guerrilla warfare, jungle conditions, and a failure to make substantial headway take their toll on the morale of U.S. troops. Many turned to drugs and alcohol as they became disillusioned with America's war effort. Most American soldiers firmly believed in their cause to halt the spread of communism and took pride in fulfilling their duty just as their fathers had done in World War II. Johnson's Great Society also suffered as the war grew more costly, the nation's economy began to fail, and the Great Society programs were cut by $6 billion in 1967. Through the media, specifically television, Vietnam became America's first living room war. Combat footage appeared nightly on the evening news, and news footage showed stark pictures which contradicted the government's optimistic reports. And I can remember seeing some of these first news images on the evening news coming from Vietnam when I was a child myself. Westmoreland quoted body counts that seemed to indicate the Viet Cong were losing. McNamara reported that he could see, quote, the light at the end of the tunnel. But the repeated images of Americans in body bags transmitted into American living rooms every night at supper time told a different story. 16,000 Americans died in battle in Vietnam between 1961 and 1967. Critics charged that a credibility gap was growing between what the Johnson administration was reporting and what was actually happening. By 1967, Americans were evenly split over supporting or opposing the war, but a small group of the nation's youth had already begun actively protesting the war. Their voices would grow louder and capture the attention of the entire nation. Most soldiers who fought in Vietnam were called into combat by the Selective Service System, or draft. Thousands attempted to find ways around the draft. One of the most common ways was to receive a college deferment by enrolling in college. The war thus became a working man's war. Almost 80% of American soldiers in Vietnam came from lower economic levels. African Americans served in disproportionate numbers as ground combat troops. They accounted for more than 20% of American combat deaths in Vietnam, despite the fact that they represented less than 10% of the U.S. population during those same years. Martin Luther King Jr. refrained from speaking out against the war for fear that it would divert attention from the civil rights movement. In 1967, he lashed out against what he called the cruel irony of American blacks dying for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. In 1968, U.S. troop strength in Vietnam peaked at 5,360,000 combat troops in Vietnam. The roots of the war opposition included the New Left, a growing youth movement in the 1960s that demanded sweeping changes in American society. Also, the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, which was founded in 1960 by Tom Hayden and Al Haber, charged that corporations and large government had taken over America. And also the Free Speech Movement, founded in 1964, also criticized big business and big government. In the 1960s, the American male could be drafted to go to war in Vietnam at 18, but you had to be 21 to vote. Those who opposed the war were known as Doves, while those who supported the war were known as Hawks. 1968 would prove to be a turbulent year. On January 30th, the equivalent of the Japanese New Year, known as Tet, the Viet Cong launched a daring surprise attack on numerous cities in South Vietnam. While the attacks ended in military defeat for the Viet Cong, the Tet Offensive stunned the American public and led many to believe that the war could not be won. Later that year, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and race riots would rip through more than 100 U.S. cities. Anti-war factions within the Democratic Party selected Robert F. Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy to challenge Johnson for president in 1968, but Kennedy, like his older brother, was assassinated on June 5, 1968, after winning the California Democratic primary. At the Democratic National Convention, Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, had already won the party's nomination prior to the convention. The convention was marred by the actions of over 10,000 protesters. In the end, the Republican Party took advantage over the split in the Democratic Party, and Republican candidate Richard M. Nixon, who lost the election of 1960 to John F. Kennedy, won, running on a platform of restoring law and order to America, and helped the re-entry of third-party candidate. It was helped by the entry of third-party candidate George Wallace. Nixon easily won the 1968 election. In 1969, Nixon announces the first U.S. troop withdrawals from Vietnam. Nixon and his foreign policy advisor Henry Kissinger develop a plan known as Vietnamization, the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops in order for the South Vietnamese to take a more active combat role in the war. Nixon's policy was aimed at restoring peace with honor. At the same time, Nixon secretly ordered increased bombing of North Vietnam and also ordered airstrikes against portions of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. Nixon courted the silent majority, moderate mainstream Americans who quietly supported U.S. efforts in Vietnam. In November 1969, the American media reported that on March 16, 1968, a U.S. platoon under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, Jr. had massacred innocent civilians in the village of My Lai while searching for Viet Cong rebels. The troops rounded up and shot more than 200 innocent villagers. Calley was convicted and imprisoned. On April 30, 1970, Nixon announced that U.S. troops had, in fact, invaded Cambodia to clear out North Vietnamese and Viet Cong supply centers. Upon hearing of the invasion, college students across the nation broke out in protest. At Kent State University, a massive student protest led to the burning of the ROTC building. The mayor called out the National Guard, and on May 4, 1970, the National Guard fired live ammunition into crowds of campus protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. Nixon and Kissinger's Cambodia policy cost the Nixon administration tremendous political support. By first bombing and then invading Cambodia without even notifying Congress, the president stirred anger on Capitol Hill. On December 31, 1970, Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which had given the U.S. president near independence in conducting policy in Vietnam. In June of 1971, a former Defense Department worker leaked what becomes known as the Pentagon Papers, a 7,000-page document that revealed that the government was drawing up plans to enter the war in Vietnam, even as President Johnson promised that he would not send American boys to Southeast Asia to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. The papers also showed that there was never any plan to end the war as long as the North Vietnamese persisted. The Pentagon Papers confirmed for many Americans their belief that the government had not been honest about its war intentions. Nixon ordered Kissinger to enter negotiations with the North Vietnamese prior to the 1972 elections. Kissinger announced an agreement just days before the 1972 election, and Nixon wins re-election. But the promised peace never materialized. A new peace document would be signed on January 27, 1973. On March 29, 1973, the last U.S. combat troops leave Vietnam, leaving the war entirely to ARVN troops. Within months of the U.S. departure, the ceasefire between North and South Vietnam fails, and the North launched a full-scale invasion of the South. Saigon fell in March of 1975, and images were broadcast into American homes of American soldiers, Vietnam refugees, and American consulate workers being lifted off the rooftops of the consulate by helicopters to be carried to safety on American aircraft carriers at sea. As far as the legacy of the Vietnam War goes, 58,000 Americans killed in action, 303,000 wounded in action, over $150 billion spent. North and South Vietnamese deaths are estimated to have topped 2 million. The war left serious doubts about America's military and her foreign policy. The country took steps to curb the president's war-making powers. The War Powers Act was passed in November 1973 and stipulated that a president must inform Congress within 48 hours of sending forces into a hostile area without a declaration of war. Vietnam significantly altered America's views on foreign policy. We now pause and consider possible risks to our own interest before deciding whether or not to intervene in the affairs of foreign nations.